tell me, please, how long have you been practicing martial arts?
Oh, since I was a baby, I suppose. For a long time, since I was when I was a baby, it's been around me. It's like a second language.
What pushed you to start teaching martial arts?
Oh wow! I suppose it would actually be my husband, Ron Balicki. I never even considered it, even though I grew up around my father, who taught all the time, and I would attend seminars with him, and I would see him teach all the time. But to be actually a teacher, that really started when I was with Ron. He felt that I would have an impact on women, but he also felt I would have an impact on how men might actually interpret women in the martial arts world. And so he really encouraged me to be his partner. We were like, if you remember the old Hollywood movie star Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So we were like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Except we did martial arts, not dance.
Is your way of teaching different from teaching of your husband and your father?
Oh, interesting. I think I apply more psychology. I tend to understand. Well, it depends. Hold on, let me back up. I'm sorry. Like with women learn very differently from men, I find. In fact, I find that sometimes they're a little bit intimidated. But I think for me is I am able to help them be more at ease that women can accomplish this and that they have all the capability in the world to do martial arts. And so I already kind of know psychologically, the framework to approach them with. And then as far as with men, I have to even use a little bit even more psychology because some men, sometimes they're, at first when I started teaching, they weren't quite sure about taking instruction from a woman. But then I guess it helps when you're Dan Inosanto's daughter. And so I think it kind of helped with some credibility, maybe, so to speak. And then, in a way, I'm able to kind of break down barriers. And so there's a lot of psychology sometimes in the way I have to teach. I will say, though, I love the way my father teaches. I like applying history to the martial arts lesson as well as teaching the physical aspect. I find that's actually missing in martial arts. I find a lot of martial artists don't even understand the history of what they're teaching culturally. So I try to tie those two worlds together.
Can you tell about history of system that you teach?
Well, I suppose it would have to start with my godfather, who is the late Bruce Lee, and I hear he's popular in your areas, yes. Right?
Yes.
So really that was my first introduction to understanding the world of martial arts because I would see my father and Uncle Bruce get together all the time. We would spend a lot of time with them as families. So his philosophy was Jeet Kune Do, and his art was Junpong Gung Fu, but people synonymously usually say Jeet Kune Do anyhow. But the philosophy is very important because it allows for the curiosity to explore what is right for you as an individual. So, for instance, my journey as a martial artist has been very different from Ron's journey because I'm a woman, because I'm built differently. And my journey might be different from your journey. It might be different from everybody else. So, but for me, I always had the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, and so I built from there. I learned Junpong Gung Fu, which had everything from different, which was my godfather's own form of Jeet Kune Do, and he had all these martial arts systems. I had learned Savate, which is a French kickboxing art. I learned Muay Thai, which is from Thailand. I learned Filipino martial arts. I learned fencing a little bit. I learned a whole gamut of different things, and I was very lucky that being Dan Inosanto's daughter was like being raised around a university of different martial arts, if that makes sense.
What is the most important thing in your system?
Well, like I said, the system is really based on a philosophy of Taekwondo. So it's not so much, it's really about keeping an open mind. That's probably the most important thing. Growing up and watching how the history of martial arts, how it's evolved, because I'm now 50 years old, so I've seen a lot how martial arts has changed through the decades. So back in the 1960s, when I was just a baby, if my father were here, he would tell you historically, everybody used to be very close-minded. So, for instance, maybe a judo person would never study boxing, or maybe a boxing person would never study Muay Thai. And so people were isolated, people were separated. So what was important about what Uncle Bruce was doing, and along with my father, is realizing, no, you limit yourself when you think separately. You have to stay open and come together. You have to, what's the word that I find used here? Diversity. You have to be open-minded to diversity, because when you are open-minded to diversity and learning different arts, you grow.
Can you share first 5 steps that you do with a new student?
Well, for me, what I do, I first try to get an idea of what they're used to doing. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. I had to teach an actress, Melissa McCarthy, but anyway, I had to learn very quickly what her natural abilities were for her. So, for instance, she had a tennis background. So I knew with the goals of teaching her, and she had no martial arts experience, I had to piggyback on, I had to basically take what she knew and then convert it over into martial arts. So, for instance, as a tennis player, she was used to playing this way. But I knew, if I teach her Filipino martial arts, I can help her already use the muscles that are triggered by making this motion and applying it to martial arts. And then she was able to learn it faster. So that's a much faster way sometimes to tap into teaching martial arts to people. It is. I find out what their history is in movement. I find out sometimes what their history is in martial arts, because maybe they've had previous martial arts training, but maybe it's from a different style or system. That's the second thing I need to know. And then I find out what their need is, because I teach people who might be law enforcement. I teach people in Hollywood. And then I just teach people who are just curious to know the culture. So I find out what their needs are, and then I cater to that. Because, again, I have a whole buffet of information that I can give them. You know what a buffet is, right? And so, it depends on what their needs are. So, for instance, if I'm teaching maybe a rape prevention class, I run them through short little drills that maybe can teach them how to understand knife movement. I try to teach them first how to behave defensively, and then I start to introduce material that will help them learn offensively, if that makes sense. So then when you're talking, well, it depends on the need, but for instance, so like if I'm teaching women, I tend to put things together that I think women might benefit from. So I start to maybe warm them up. I like teaching them, like, for instance, Muay Thai, but I also like to teach them knife, because I find that women, particularly when it comes to rape, it's usually they have to deal with the knife. I teach them lines of attack. I mean, and you have to, there's not one concrete way to teach a group or an individual, because everybody learns differently.
You teach both knife fighting and stick fighting. Is there any differences in teaching? No. Actually, no. It's really the expression of it. Like my father, and the one that Ron, who was a long-time student under my dad, for instance, the Lee Inosanto Guro system, there are like maybe 17 different areas of study. So you have stick, you have sword, you have knife, you have flexible weapon like the sarong, you have throwing weapons. They're all part of the same system, but there have maybe different disciplines. There's stick, single, there's stick double, there's stick and knife, there's staff, right? But the lines of attack are still the same. It's how you learn to respond to those lines of attack. It's also how you learn to express yourself. So, and then of course there's different teachers through the ages of time that have their own expression of how to teach this, if that makes sense. That's why in Filipino martial arts you'll say there's Kali, Arnes, Eskrima, but to be honest with you, they're all really the same family. It's just we call it different labels.
How do you think, what pushes a person to start learn stick fighting or knife fighting?
My dad. I think he saw, Ron had studied martial arts since he was a little boy, but I think when he realized that my father was coming to Chicago, because that's where my husband is originally from, he, and he knew my father's relationship with my godfather, with Uncle Bruce, that inspired him to reach out and to find my dad and go to his seminars. But then once he heard how my father was teaching, he became so inspired. He said, I want to know more. And so I think it starts with my father. And another man by the name of Larry Lindemann, who was already a student under my father anyhow. So it was all kind of part of the same family.
How do you think, why today so many people want to teach knife fighting?
Probably because it's the most easiest, in a sad way, it's the most common form of weaponry, right? It's probably more common than, in some cases, like if you go to England, than a gun. Here in the United States, we have people that are confronted with a knife, and so people are looking for answers. We have people in the military looking for answers for how to deal with the knife, and the police, rape prevention groups want to understand this, because a lot of times when women are confronted by a stranger, there's always a knife in the situation. But there's knife fighting, and then there's knife self-defense, and I want to make that distinction. It's always, as my father taught me, when you are learning martial arts, it's because you really are learning to preserve one's body, your family, to protect your village, your town. So it's to me, I think people have to ask themselves too, when they learn this kind of knowledge, are they learning it in order to serve humanity, or are they learning it because they're going to a dark place? Does that make sense? So that's why I'm also trying to be vigilant of who I teach. If I sense that I have a student that might use this information for corrupt reasons and not for the purpose of self-defense and to better serve one's community, I will hold back the information. I do not teach everything that I've been taught. And that's an instruction I get from my father. He always told me, be very careful who you hand the information to, because you want people to be responsible with the knowledge.
Do you have certain criteria according to which you can understand who is the real master and who is not?
Sometimes, as a woman, for me, I rely on intuition. Sometimes before I even enter a room, I'm already looking at students, how they are behaving with each other. That tells me a lot. It's like, for instance, sometimes people will say, well, how do you deal with a man who's a male chauvinist? And I find that the man who might be a male chauvinist is also probably very difficult with his other fellow men. Does that make sense? So then maybe somebody like that I will hold back. Maybe somebody that I will teach self-defense, but I won't teach the offense material as much. I won't stress the offense material as much, only the self-defense. Because we all should be defending ourselves anyhow, right? But to be able to engage in teaching the art of combat is very different. Does that make sense?
How do you think, does knife fighting have some future in 21st century?
It depends.
in the realm of sport, I mean, you see competitions, popping up everywhere in the United States and now in Europe, I've noticed. And I think that has its place, just like there's fencing, just as there's Filipino martial arts competitions. It has its place, and I appreciate it. But and then of course in Hollywood, for movies like with Matt Damon, like Born Identity, to a little bit. 300 was more sword work, but you see it more often, and I'm fine with that. I'm much more concerned, though. I think when it comes to the military or when it comes to the streets, because I think it's important that people are armed with knowledge of how to protect oneself. And we're lucky that we live in the 21st century, that we have information via the internet where we can share and we can talk like what you're doing, share information. And so I think that is what has exponentially caused such growth in knowledge, because we have the internet now. Whereas before the internet, either myself, with my husband, my father, we would have to go from city to city or from country to country to teach. But so, the information is there. However, I will say this, when you're learning on the internet, it still doesn't take the place of finding the right training partners to understand tactile reflex. Because even though I may show you something on the internet and you can copy it, you're never going to quite understand it unless you understand the movement of it, unless you can feel it. Feeling it and understanding the positioning of one's body is so important. And so that's why it's good. It's a blessing, really, when you can find a good training partner and a good teacher that can merge those worlds together.
How do you think why today we have such a situation when one person learning knife fighting in the gym for 3-5 years, but when he faced a real situation on the street, he doesn't know what to do, he just run away or freeze? Why does it happen?
Well, I can give you what I've learned from a wonderful, famous, famous, I guess you could say, I call him a warrior. His name was Richard Marcinko, and he actually was the one that started SEAL Team 6. And I've read a few of his books, but I absolutely agree with his philosophy that it is important to be with a group that is able to, or a teacher or a training partner that can train and assimilate real life situations without getting hurt, because you don't want to damage your partner. And I like Richard Marcinko's philosophy because he truly believed that you train harder in the practice runs, in your training every day, so that when the time does come, if something does come up, then you're ready. I mean, there's no guarantees in life. All you can do is have whatever knowledge you have been exposed to, and those are your tools. But I would think if somebody freezes up, it's because they haven't trained in the dojo or in the academy or in the gym and assimilated real life scenarios. So that part of the brain can kick in and say, oh, I'm familiar with this. I understand. This is what I've trained a million times in the gym. So when that time does come in real life, you're ready. And Richard Marcinko talks about that quite a bit, that's why the Navy SEALs were so successful, is because they trained and made their training assimilate and mirror real life as much as they could.
There are a lot of kinds of knife fighting: Filipino, Spanish, Italian knife fighting. Your system comes from generation to generation. What distinguishes your system from others?
Again, it goes back to philosophy. We part of what Ron and I, our organization is called Martial Arts Research Systems, or MARS, and it's because we take the approach that everything needs to be studied like a scientist. Do you know what I mean? And we try to break it down, and really, it's a tribute to my dad and Uncle Bruce. About always being curious and always researching and finding
what information is out there. And it goes all the way back to my father and my godfather. When in the 1960s, I remember as a little girl, I would see my father and Uncle Bruce, and my dad would take notes, and Uncle Bruce would be talking about different points that I've noticed, because back then people didn't know what Muay Thai was, and so my godfather would learn Muay Thai. He learned Indonesian Silat, and he wanted to understand their weaknesses, their strengths, why the art evolved the way it did. A lot of times it had to do with the culture. A lot of times it had to do with the environment. So, for instance, Silat, the terrain is very different. It's slippery, it's muddy. So that's why you have the low crouching angles. And so, he also would talk about the Gurkhas, who are known as the arm of the crown in England, and just the different military approaches. So it's really about understanding why you are using certain material, whether it's judo, whether it's jiu-jitsu, and when to use it and when not to use it. That's probably what our system tries to stress, and we build that into muscle memory. And so it's a very scientific approach when you think about it. In a way, it sort of follows kind of a sports scientist methodology that they use. Like, for instance, in football, one of my dearest friends was a man by the name of Dr. Bob Ward, and he used to train the Dallas Cowboys. But he was able to help introduce martial arts into football, and a lot of people didn't know that at the time, because he understood that football was the little brother of war, because it's two forces coming at each other. And so he knew scientifically, as a sports scientist, that you could merge these two worlds and they would benefit each other, if that makes sense. So that's what I say our system is about. It's a very scientific approach to understanding movement.
How do you think does martial arts change mindset of a person?
In many ways. So, for instance, I can't speak for other parts of the world, but I can tell you this: in America, most of the time when people learn martial arts, the good thing is most of the time they won't ever have to use it, which is good, unless they do it professionally as a fighter in the ring or in Hollywood, where it's already just kind of fight choreography. But I find, for me, I use it in my daily life. I've used it in Hollywood when I'm in board meetings. If I'm having meetings with an executive, I have a mindset already. I don't get intimidated. And that's the beautiful thing, that what martial arts particularly could give girls and women is a certain confidence, and boys and men too, but particularly when I look at women, the fate of women around the world, I want to see them be able to rise and be on an equal playing field with men. And so when I think about martial arts, it's really it mentally makes you stronger, and it mentally makes you focus, and it mentally makes you be able to understand the different angles of how to approach different people. And that's the beautiful thing about what martial arts does.
Is it important for you which knife to use?
Well, differences in weapons. I personally like the knife, but I do find it's fun to do stick training for double stick, right? But I like it because for the mental health benefits, because when you're working the right brain and the left brain, you're getting a workout, not only physically but up here, because the brain is learning to receive information. I like that for that reason alone. But I also do like knife. I've with Ron, we've trained it so much, and I personally love that I can, particularly for women, teach them to have a tool, something that they can use out there. It should something happen to them. Mm-hmm. But I love it all, But those are the ones that I tend to feel most at home with, and maybe that is just because I train it the most.
What you can recommend to people that just started learn stick and knife fighting?
Be very patient with yourself. Sometimes people might feel frustrated if they don't get it at once. It's a process. We all learn differently, and just keep an open mind. And I would also say too, try not to just stay with one instructor. I sometimes feel people maybe limit themselves to one school. Go and visit other people teaching seminars to get a taste and a flavor, because you might find some little detail that might make you go, oh, wow, this is different. I'm going to keep that as a tool in here, because there's always something we can all teach each other. Sometimes even my students come up with things. I go, that's really clever, because again, it's also about exploring. So, that's what I would say. Be very patient and allow yourself to read up on other teachers and find out what works for you.
And action.